As previously noted, yesterday was a big day for performatively emotional displays by henpecked men. During the January 6th hearing, one man after another took turns bawling his eyes out, weeping openly and without shame. The most grotesque and nauseating spectacles came, as always, from the politicians. Here is Representative Adam Schiff getting choked up for unclear reasons.
We deem elections illegitimate merely because they didn't go our way, rather than trying to do better the next time. God help us. And if we're so driven by bigotry and hate that we attack our fellow citizens as traitors, if they're born in another country or they don't look like us, and God help us. But I have faith because of folks like you. And Adam, I didn't expect this would be quite so emotional either, but it must be an Adam thing today. But I'm so grateful to all of you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
He's got to work on his acting a little bit. I appreciate the timing. So he timed his emotional breakdown for when he mentioned bigotry. You know, that's when he's, we have to be nicer to people who don't look like us. Bigotry is so upsetting to me. So he timed it well, but the acting needs a little bit of work. He wasn't the only Adam to carry on this way. Adam Kinzinger, a Republican, sobbed even louder. It was an inspiring moment of bipartisan emasculation. Let's watch that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleagues on the committee. Thank you to our witnesses. I never expected today to be quite as emotional for me as it has been. I've talked to a number of you and gotten to know you. I think it's important to tell you right now, though. You guys may, individually feel a little broken. You guys all talk about the effects you have to deal with, and, you talk about the impact of that day. But you guys won. You guys held. Democracies are not defined by our bad days. We're defined by how we come back from bad days, how we take accountability for that. And for all the overheated rhetoric surrounding this committee, our mission is very simple. It's to find the truth, and it's to ensure accountability.
Sorry, I'm getting a little emotional too. A little misty-eyed. Now, it goes without saying that neither of these men have shed any tears, as we discussed earlier, for any of the victims of any of the horrific BLM riots last year. Police officers were bashed over the head with bricks, beat, attacked, berated. This is all on video. Their precincts were burned to the ground. A retired police officer was murdered in cold blood and left for dead in the street. Neither of the crying Adams have ever shed any tears for those officers. By the way, that should be a band name, the Crying Adams. That's because their tears are fake and manipulative. Fake and manipulative tears from anyone are disgraceful, but from a man, even more so. Even leaving aside the rank dishonesty here, this is also part of a larger problem, a symptom of an endemic disease. The fact that grown men will now cry to get what they want, like my 8-year-old daughter, only shows, again, that masculinity is in a dire state in this culture. There was a time when that sort of display would have been considered embarrassing and weak. But now we're meant to take a man seriously when he cries in front of us, even more seriously, if anything. I think this is wrong, to put it mildly. And I've said so many times. I reiterated this point on Twitter yesterday. This is what I wrote. Simply, I said, men should not cry in public. It is unmanly and dishonorable. Rare exceptions can be made to this rule, but we make far too many exceptions. And the exceptions are pretty obvious. A loved one dies, your child is born, your bride is walking down the aisle at your wedding. In the latter two cases, a dignified tear or two may be acceptable, but please don't turn the faucet on. Okay, there's no reason to go overboard. Don't try to prove a point. Other exceptions can be imagined. We've talked about some of them before. Perhaps, for example, you're saying goodbye to your family before embarking on a 3-year voyage to Mars. Maybe you're watching the end of the movie Rudy. Aside from those rare occurrences, the point is that men should comport themselves with a certain level of stoicism and dignity, learning to control their emotions and projecting an image of strength. of someone who is composed and in control. Yeah, it's possible to go overboard in that direction, becoming an emotionless robot entirely unaffected by suffering, your own or anyone else's. But there aren't very many men in our society who are at any risk of falling into that trap. The problem in most cases lies way at the other end of the spectrum. Men today are encouraged to put their emotions on display at all times, to be vulnerable, to be soft and feminine and gentle. Men are encouraged to be women, in other words. In fact, some of the responses to my tweet were pretty enlightening. Lots of people, of course, were scoffing at the opinion that I expressed, even though it's an opinion shared by most people in the world, whether they'll say it out loud or not. Most women naturally want a man who will comfort them when they cry. They don't want to be doing most of the comforting. I'm not a woman myself, so I will allow the ladies to correct me on this point. But I can't imagine that most single women are searching for the kind of man who will break down in tears at the slightest disappointment or setback. Few women, I'm guessing, dream of the sort of man who will come home from work, tears dripping down his cheeks, sobbing and saying, "I just had a really bad day. Hank at the office was super rude. I am so frustrated." I would also theorize that the typical woman wouldn't marry a man at all if she knew that he'd be the type to shake her awake in the middle of the night, teary-eyed and trembling and saying, "I just heard a noise outside. Can you go out and check? I'm so scared." Few women want men who are like this. Few boys want to grow into men like this. And yet our culture produces men like this. This may not be something that the average person desires, but it is the agenda all the same. An agenda shared by, for example, a woman named Rachel Baribeau. She's not any great cultural force by any means, but she is a former sportscaster turned, it seems, into some kind of motivational speaker for students and young men. I know of her existence because she tweeted at me in response to my thoughts about men crying, and she said 2 words: "Shut up." Yep, I've got my sassy pants on today. We are changing the narrative on what masculinity means, despite what this guy says. Now, again, this is not any kind of a person of any great importance, but there is something so apt about this. Here is a woman who likely doesn't represent the views of most women, we should know, but a woman all the same, telling me, a man, to shut up on the subject of masculinity and to defer to her expertise. She, not only a woman, but a person who uses the phrase sassy pants, has decided that she should be in charge of changing the narrative on masculinity. As for me, a man, a husband, a father of 4, I have to pipe down and allow her to dictate terms. Sadly, many men have decided to obey these kinds of demands from these kinds of women. Our culture has indeed allowed women to take the lead, even to the extent of defining masculinity. We see this in our schools, in our churches, in Hollywood and media. We live in an increasingly feminine world. Though ironically, men are once again reasserting their dominance by identifying as women and bringing everything full circle. It is a confused situation, to say the least. Now, into this confusion, as a way of clearing the fog a little bit, I'd like to offer a clarifying image of what masculinity is actually supposed to be and how it is supposed to act in the world. This is a story I've mentioned a couple of times on the show, but it's worth mentioning again in this situation. It comes from Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, his magnum opus about the Soviet labor camp system. In one of the volumes, volume 1, I believe, he recounts the story of a man who had been arrested on trumped-up charges and shipped off to prison. And when he was at prison, he was sentenced to death. But by the time the sentence had been handed down, his wife was already on a boat on the way to visit him. And so he begged the guards to delay his execution for a few days so that he could see his wife one last time. They agreed on the condition that he doesn't tell her about his impending execution. And he didn't. He was with her for 3 days, never mentioned it, never hinted at it. And once she left, he was taken immediately before the firing squad and shot. Now, that is stoicism and manliness beyond the capacity of most mere mortals, but it points us in the direction that we should be striving towards. We are meant as men to carry our burdens with dignity and not to expect everyone else, least of all the women in our lives, to lighten our loads by always sharing in them. That, at least, is one way to be a man. The other is Adam Schiff, weeping like a schoolgirl, using his tears to manipulate and exploit. You could choose that option if you want, but you have to sacrifice your dignity and your masculinity and your self-respect in the process. And also, you are today, for that reason, canceled. Listen, hit that subscribe button right now. Do it right now. I thank you for your compliance. It is somewhat appreciated.